Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. We have been doing a lot of prep work in the last couple of weeks, getting ready to talk to these folks, and this is a really interesting group. Just to sort of set the stage here, we'll give you just a little bit of the urgency that we're all sort of in. And one of the pieces of urgency for me is that I, like so many people in this room, have kids of the exact age we're going to be talking about today. I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old daughter. Wow. And I'm in the midst of creating at the school that they go to, we've basically enacted a school-wide pledge for parents to keep smartphones out of the hands of the kids until they're out of this school, which ends in 8th grade. And it has raised holy hell with the kids. They hate that, as you can imagine. There's no thanks for anyone in getting that done. But one thing that we keep having to remind each other as we meet time and again to talk about this pledge and refine it for blended families or single parent households or all the various mitigating circumstances that everyone can think of, we keep reminding each other, it's just us. Right now, it is only us. It's just parents winging it. And we are the only bulwark there has been, really, until now, when it comes to standards for social media use of any kind, boundaries, repercussions for the companies that make social media. These things have been utterly unregulated, and it's been an utterly open environment. And parents really are the only solution there has been until now. And what I'm hopeful about in the conversations that we've already had with this panel in preparation for this, is that this might be the kind of group that might start to come to the rescue, might start to give parents something to rely on other than their ability to get along in the edges of their day the way we've been trying to at our school. So I'm going to start by sort of setting the scene here, and as I go here, I'm going to introduce each person here. So Dr. Vassan, sitting down here, right, is Chief Medical Officer for the City of New York. And I want to start with you to just sort of set the tone for us, the stage for us when it comes to the difficulty that we are in, the nature of the crisis when it comes to mental health and young people. Your city is now, you are part of a lawsuit against major social media companies around this. Set the stage for us a little bit. How do you think about the crisis we are in?
Yeah, good to be here. A lot of my colleagues ask me, why is this in your purview? Like, why are public health departments, public health systems taking this issue on? It's because the mental health crisis we're in is real, it's tangible. We can see it in our emergency rooms, in our schools, in our communities, and in our homes. I'm first and foremost a dad. I have 3 small kids. My oldest is 10, and while the youngest are not yet having these issues, I'm having conflict with my 10-year-old about these devices and about the platforms on these devices. So it's a very real thing for me. And I think let's talk a little bit about what we know and what we don't know. I mean, everyone's looking for a smoking gun, right? Everyone's looking for that singular study that links this platform or this content to this health outcome. And yet, that's not coming for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think social media is not one exposure, right? It's a lot of different things. Reading written content on Twitter is different than seeing 30-second algorithmic video feeds. Number two, I think we're subjecting this issue to a litmus test that we wouldn't subject other environmental conditions or environmental risk factors to. And make no mistake, this is an environmental toxin. It's a digital toxin. It's in our social environment, but it's all around us. And so what's our job? Our job is to define what's safe and unsafe, to define a level or a dose that might be appropriate, and then to take some steps to control it. And so part of my job as a city official is to say, what can government do? And I know our mayor is very supportive of this as well. So what have we done? We launched the largest mental health survey in the history of New York City, and frankly, the biggest in any city. And 4 major trends are coming out of that data that are very consistent with what we know from the rest of the data. Number 1, more screen time is leading to more frequency of anxiety, depression, mental health conditions. And why do we know that's true? That's both for teens and younger kids. Why do we know that's true? Because we know the data around screens and neurotransmitters, right? So since TV came, we've been doing research on how moving images on screens lead to dopamine, lead to GABA, lead to serotonin. These are all chemicals in our brain that are associated with addiction, and addiction and mental health are very closely associated. So we know that more time on screens, more mental health conditions. Number two, we know that kids who have prior risks of trauma or known diagnoses of mental health conditions are more at risk for bad mental health outcomes. So that seems pretty self-explanatory. And that's consistent in our data and consistent across the world's data. Number three, there's a big gap between perception and actual harm. So when we ask people to self-report whether they think their social media use is problematic or their child's use is problematic, oh, no, everything's fine. My use is not fine. It's someone else's kids or it's someone else over there. And that's very similar to what we see in data, for example, around family planning and sexual activity, right? No one really wants to talk about what they might be doing. They're very willing to comment on what other people are doing. And the last major theme that's coming out from New York as well as around the country is people want government to act uniformly. 90% of parents and teens want government to do something because we feel outgunned, we feel outmanned, we feel like as you opened, we are left to the wolves. And we're in the midst of this natural experiment, and our kids are the subjects. And I'm not okay with that, and yet we've to date responded like we are okay with that. So what do we need to do? I'll take you back to 1968. What happened in 1968? Many things happened in 1968, but one thing that happened was that we passed the National Highway Transportation Safety Act, and that
Sesame Street was started too.
Sesame Street was started. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
I did miss that
I'm
one.
sorry.
Democratic Convention,
No,
some other things.
yeah.
Challenging year, 68. But one good thing that happened was that we passed the NHTSA, and that led to seatbelts. And it was government stepping in after seeing evidence year on year that cars were getting faster, the highway system was getting bigger and faster, and that automobile accidents were going up, fatal automobile accidents were going up, and we regulated seatbelts in every car. What we didn't do is ask each auto company to come up with their own seatbelt, their own version, or their own solution, and then say, you can self-regulate this. Government stepped in, and so that's what we need to do, and that's what we're beginning to do.
Let me jump in on that. So Bill Reddy, sitting next to us right over here, is CEO of Pinterest, right? And you've been CEO of Pinterest for
about 2 years.
About 2 years, right? So, and you wrote an op-ed for The Hill. I'm going to quote a little bit of it here. And in fact, in another interview with the Financial Times, you actually mentioned seatbelts as an example of a kind of public-private partnership you thought was sort of helpful. But here's what you said in The Hill. Unlike the tobacco industry decades ago, we actually need to hold ourselves accountable. The harm will be substantial if we don't. It is time for industry leaders to accept responsibility and build online platforms centered on positive well-being outcomes. Tell me a little bit about what it is to inherit a social media company like you did, and to now think about whether or not should we, is government, would you want government to come in and regulate the way that the doctor is talking about here, or is this something that the government, that the companies should regulate themselves somehow?
Yeah, thank you. An opportunity to make an impact on the youth mental health crisis was one of the biggest reasons I joined Pinterest 2 years ago. Pinterest has always had at its core, positivity. And at the same time, there's a lot of these things that have been driving the mental health impact of social media that were pretty pervasive across the industry. Things like algorithmically derived feeds, maximizing view time, all these things. And I think that the research has become pretty clear. Maybe it won't quite be the full direct linkage that you were talking about, but I think the evidence there's a preponderance of the evidence that's pretty clear that social media really started to shift in the moment when you stopped seeing a chronological feed of what your friends posted and started seeing what an algorithm that we now call AI, which was really sort of early iterations of AI, was really put in charge of what you see.
I just want to point out what a big deal it is, right? That we're sitting in the room with the CEO of Pinterest who's saying that out loud. This is not a thing, in my experience, 20 years interviewing people like this, people have been willing to say up until now in the position that you are in. Why for you, have you come around to being as comfortable as you are saying that out loud?
Well, first of all, I mean, I've spent my career building digital products, and while I hadn't, Venmo was my company, sold that to PayPal. There was a social feed in that. Not these same issues, but I was very much part of the early days of social, thinking that social is making the world a better place, and democracies were rising up, and we were reconnecting with long lost friends, and those things were all true. But then one day it changed, right? And you started to notice, it was more toxic and more vitriolic and more divisive. What changed? Algorithms were put in charge of what you see. And I don't think anybody intended those outcomes, but I do think what the algorithms figured out was what makes you view the longest. That was the objective they were given. And it sort of figured out that you linger for longer on things that are triggering. And so whatever your trigger is, it will figure out what that trigger is and then maximize it. And so coming into Pinterest, one of the central premises I had was, how do we prove a different business model for social media? One built on positivity. So if engagement via enragement has become at the center of a lot of the social media business models, why can't we prove out a different business model? Unlike the comparison to big tobacco, which I think in many ways for social media, that comparison is appropriate. But what's different than big tobacco is that, I don't know of a healthy use of tobacco. There are good things that you can do with social media. So really, how do we start to tune for the more positive outcomes? And can we prove there's a good business model built around positivity, tuning for those outcomes? And the metaphor that I've used is similar to this is, if you go back to, before the NHTSA, there were auto manufacturers saying that safety standards were against the business model. And yes, you needed regulation to come along, but at the same time, car companies started to compete on their safety records. And so yes, was it good to have some minimum safety standards? Certainly so. But then Volvo invents the 3-point safety belt and builds a whole brand around safety. And now you wouldn't buy a car that just meets the minimum safety standards. You want to make sure that you're putting your kids in a car that well exceeds those safety standards. So that's what I'm hoping we can do, is start to, I'd love to wake up in a world where social media platforms were competing on their safety standards. And you thought about the safety standards of the social media platforms in the same way you now think about the safety standards of the vehicle you put your kids in.
Right. So Sherry, you are president and interim CEO of Sesame Street, right? And we're thinking here about, I think all of us in this room think about teenagers specifically. We saw the Facebook whistleblowers speaking out about the harms to that particular age group, especially girls. But obviously Sesame Street has built its brand on being, sort of creating the earliest possible intervention, right, to get a kid on the right track. I'm thinking about a teacher I was talking to the other day who said, because every educator in here knows that we're seeing stuff that we haven't really seen before. It's the same flavor of it, but it's on steroids. And this one teacher said to me, it's as if, speaking of the kids, it's as if they think they are the main character, but they also think they're anonymous. And that has created this incredible complication for them as educators. So tell me a little bit about, should we be dialing the dial back toward younger and younger? Is there something being realized now in adolescence that maybe has been set off very early developmentally for these kids?
Well, I think the most important thing is, children are growing up in a digital world, whether we like it or not. So that is the reality. And I think with so many of these issues, absolutely you're talking about older ages, but whenever you start young, you have a better chance of building the foundation that children need to navigate these challenges. And so with Sesame, we are doing a lot of work on research and on content, thanks to Google.org actually, who's doing a big project with us on creating products and doing research on how do we establish digital well-being. So with a child who's going to be in a digital world, what are the things that we need to help families establish? What choices should they be making that affect the whole family? And how do we help use media to really be building the strength, the resilience, the digital well-being that a child would need? And I just want to say, if you think about Sesame's origins, I'm sorry I interrupted you on that, but it was the late 60s. Television was considered a vast wasteland, but it was the new medium of the day. And Sesame Street was created as an experiment to see if television could be used to teach. It's not a question of whether children learn from television, it's what they learn. And so that was particularly designed because so many children in poverty were falling behind, and could television be used to give all children access to quality early learning? So it was taking that medium and really looking at it through the lens of children. And I think what we see today is what every new technology, every new medium, children are an afterthought. And we have to change that narrative and in a much more positive way. We have a responsibility to protect children, but we also have an opportunity to be using these platforms. I mean, it's so great what you've done, and to be creating content and platforms where it's an opportunity for children in terms of creativity, in terms of empowerment, in terms of giving them the skills they need through the digital content. And I think, you know, that's what we have to be doing, and I think we need to be starting very young.
So if we think now, right, pivoting toward solutions, Jen, I'm sorry to make you go last, but I'm
No,
going to
it's
make you go
great.
last. So Ken, right, Kenneth Cole, you know him as a fashion name, but right, you have worked in the past, you've done AMFAR, you've been a UN ambassador around HIV/AIDS, you know, and now you've put together this mental health coalition, dozens of mental health agencies coming together to try to establish some standards around social media use. Where are we with that? And by extension, does it strike you as odd that it requires a kind of grassroots coming together? I mean, the groups that come together under the umbrella of Mental Health Coalition remind me a little bit of the parents coming together at my school, just trying to come together for some kind of traction around this issue, because nobody else, no grand convening authority seems to be able to do it. Tell me, first of all, just where are you guys at in the development of something like a standard of safe use of something like social media?
So thank you for that. So first, I mean, just a little more context, if I may.
Please.
So the Mental Health Coalition was founded 4 or 5 years ago, and my daughters were involved. And it was an effort to bring together a cross section of all these different organizations, all under the notion that 1 in 4 people are impacted. 1 out of 4 apparently will live with mental health conditions. We say it's 4 out of 4 because if it isn't you, it's somebody you love, somebody in the family or the community. So you need to change the narrative, and you need a new vocabulary. You need tools to kind of address and navigate this new landscape. So we went into this thing with the plans to rebrand mental health, and then we started with NAMI. Then NAMI says we're fine if you want to broaden the tent. So, because this was so much bigger, invariably with culture changes. So we reached out to all of the largest mental health service providers in the country, and we've ended up building probably the largest coalition anywhere, I think. And under the notion that 1 + 1 equals so much more than 2, and you can, and then so it's a cross section of all these various at-risk communities all come together. And then we apply certain business principles, which is scale, leverage, and ultimately impact, and transparent impact. So, and how to identify opportunities, needs. Let's get rid of a lot of the redundancy and duplicity, align on best intentions. So what we're talking about now is there was this, a lot of people have been calling for, we all know about the crisis and the problem. The data that I read, I think I read pretty much everything. There is a lot of indication that this is not good for our kids, but there's nothing conclusive at the end of the day. There's so many other factors. It is an important factor. It isn't the sole cause of it. And access to the internet, access to gaming, access to these phones and online. And there's all this technology that somehow, there's this cross-section that plays a role. But meanwhile, it is a problem and it has to be addressed. So we put together a cross-section of 20 experts from around the world on adolescent mental health, on standards development, on technology, and we challenge them to build the first set of standards that have yet to be, that nobody's been able to do up until now. And they're done. So we've created them. And now the goal, phase 2, is to come up with an implementation strategy and and ultimately a rating system and a mechanism to hold people accountable. And tech has all agreed to support us. Also, interestingly, tech has all kind of come and support as well too. And these guys, you know, it's so easy to put a target on all these tech companies. They are unquestionably some of the most accomplished, and I don't want to sit in defense of them, but business people and engineers and marketing people, and they've built this amazing platform, and their mission statements are to connect people everywhere, are to bring joy and creativity to people everywhere. Nothing about health. None of them have degrees in psychiatry and none of them, that's not how they get incentivized. That's not how they get compensated. That's not how, what they're tasked to do. But they all want to be part of the solution. So they can't self-regulate to Ashwan's point earlier. And and they're begging for tools to accomplish this. We have a board member that says, why don't you throw in AI on top of that? And I says that you want to make sure we get nothing done, right? So, but I do believe we will establish the first set of standards, of functional standards. There's 5 basic standards and then categories and 24 standards underneath them. We're going to be releasing them shortly. And hopefully there's something that for educators and for legislators, and because you can't, everybody's well-intended, but absent of something to legislate, absent of something to work with, there's no path forward to do that. So I believe we hopefully will be able to do that.
So thinking now, right, about this landscape we're in, right, where the good works of a philanthropist like Kenneth Cole, right, is kind of, or that Ashwan wins in court, or that Bill acts on the great impulses that have brought him into his job, or that Sherry turns the dial on young people, right? We may really need to legislate this stuff, right? And I think about your position, Jen, as first partner of California. California has been the de facto federal lawmaker around a lot of cutting-edge issues, right? California's auto emission standards are the standards for the nation now, simply because those companies don't have to make a separate set of cars for non-California buyers. Do you think that there is a role that California will have to play in that, sort of, again, are we going to need a big regional power, a big state like California to put its feet down to make this happen? Do you think that could be the plan? Can you tell us anything about that?
Sure. It's so good to be here with everyone today. And, San Francisco, California, California really has led when it comes to children's mental health and well-being in terms of our billion-dollar investments in meeting kids and families where they're at to counter this, this dangerous place that we find ourselves in with not just growing addiction and division and mental health, but the harm being caused to our children who, again, are our future. And I'm a mother of 4, 8-year-old boy, 10-year-old girl, 12-year-old boy, and 14-year-old daughter. And we've already experienced, and I was already, caring about this before and supported the age-appropriate design code that we passed in California or signed into legislation, but which again is stuck in the courts because of various folks in technology who aren't, willing to go back in and look at their design and the safety issues related to that, which is a bummer because the UK, signed this into legislation prior to us, and other countries are moving forward in ways where we're sadly being held back by capitalist interests. So I share all that because we, it is a dance, and I think one of the reasons I gave myself the title First Partner and not First Lady is because it is about partnership between the public and private sector. So for me, legislation is necessary if the tech companies aren't going to be more transparent and with not just their safety and invest in safety and not just put up the front that they're going to provide safety. We know that they're not, and I'm making a documentary on that and have spent a lot of time with whistleblowers and those who you all saw and read everything, know what's really going on behind the scenes. So I think what we're doing to counter that while we're waiting for the tech companies to take responsibility and be more accountable, and legislation, if necessary, to continue to be more creative and dynamic and pass at the federal level and at the state level. We're, again, meeting families where they're at. We've invested in everything from wellness counselors at school. We've invested, again, billions of dollars in trauma-informed training for educators and administrators and caregivers. We've invested, again, millions of dollars in community-based organizations which are providing preventative care. We've invested money in online hubs, Tech for Good, apps like Saluna, which is for teens, and Bright Life, which is for 0 to 12, the 0 to 12 age group, really for parents and caregivers, which again is best use of technology, providing online coaches and, again, resources and best practices for their parents and children. We have invested in, obviously, all this ACEs, screening and work and solutions to once again meet families where they're at. A lot of my husband's investments in the community school model is ensuring that these resources are at school, available not just to the children but to the community. We've partnered with Child Mind Institute, a global organization which has created both the Thriving or Healthy Minds, Thriving Kids, age-appropriate video series and curricula for educators and children and their families on breath work, mindfulness, coping skills, all of that. And then we just came out with Positive Parenting, Thriving Kids, a basically video series and curricula for families to basically help them with some of these really complex issues as relates to parenting in the modern age. And then finally, I'll just share, we have Tech Tips for Good that are coming out next week through an organization that I co-founded, the California Partners Project, and a family guide that'll be out this month. And then I've also been leading the Governor's Advisory Council on Physical Fitness and Mental Well-Being that is providing, we have launched a campaign, Move Your Body, Calm Your Mind. We're doing a lot of work trying to get more mindfulness into schools and daily movement, because schools haven't always met the standards for not just PE and recess, but the type of movement, play-based movement, and again, the mindfulness being so important. So I share all that because we're just, again, realizing there's a crisis. It was here prior to the pandemic. We're trying to bring tech companies to the table. I have an event afterwards with Lisa Ling, who is a partner of mine on a lot of this work related to digital design and children's well-being. And again, I just share this, that we're just trying to innovate while the private sector gets its act together and the public sector figures out how they're going to continue to incentivize and move tech forward. But it's tricky, and as, again, a parent of 4, I delayed. I waited till 14 for my eldest to have a phone. And granted, we're public figures, but what we're seeing, sadly, of adults coming after our own children online, parents of children, and then the children mimicking it, I actually pulled my daughter from school. I'm sharing that. I haven't shared that publicly, but it's bad.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'll share one last thing, because it's so serious. I was just with Meghan Markle talking about all of the wonderful work that she and the Duke are doing with the Parents Network, and obviously they were testifying on the Hill. And it's not okay that we are allowing for our children to be not just addicted, but to allow for the level of cyberbullying and hate speech and racism and misogyny online, and the doxing. Too many young girls in particular, thank you so much, but too many young girls in particular are, going down paths of self-harm that, again, we were not exposed to, right? Young boys, because I do a lot of work on gender and gender norms, young boys being exposed to harmful stereotypes and narratives about what it is to be a young man, being pulled farther to the right as our young girls are developing their voice and trying to stand in their power. And advocate for equality and justice. It's like we are doing a serious disservice to the future of this country, and we have to get it right with young children in particular. So I continue to stand with Tech for Good and desire tech for good, and I applaud you
Yeah.
for leaning in on the public policy side. But we can't do it alone. So it has to be about partnership and the good people like you who are leading who can help us get there. So I'm an optimist, but I think we
Yeah.
have a lot of work to do.
Right, right. You know, so I think about here so like 5 days ago, France, the big Élysée, the National University of France, basically announced their recommendations to the government, which is no phone before 13, no social media before 18. National recommendation, that's going to be their new standard, it looks like, in France, right? Country of 60 million people, diverse environment, they somehow are just sort of landing with 2 feet on that, right? We've seen other nations step right up on these kinds of recommendations. You know, I want to point out to anybody, there's a QR code that comes up periodically on the monitor behind me, and please use it to throw questions in. There are already some good ones throwing in. One here is the tech and social media companies are making billions out of our kids' eyeballs. So how do we tell them that money flow is going to stop? They are not going to be happy about that. Yeah. It makes me think here about something that the Chief Science Officer of the American Psychological Association, this guy Mitch Prinstein, who I follow a lot, very interesting, very outspoken person. He said in congressional testimony last year, he basically lays out this whole thing about how the brain develops in these multiple stages, and that when you're like 10 or 12 years old, your early top layer of the brain is the one coming in, and that is these cravings for social rewards, these desires to fit in with your peers, these very sort of they're sophisticated, but they're basic desires. Those have come in around then, but it takes 10 to 15 years, up until you're 25 years old, for your self-regulation to come in, your emotional regulation, all of that stuff. So I think, Bill, maybe I'll just throw this at you to start, and then I'd love to hear, Ashwin, from you as well on this. There was a long time when companies were saying 13 is old enough, basically, for kids to run free on the internet, and that somehow became this kind of weird standard. And when you actually asked anybody who knew anything about development, they'd say that's the craziest time to turn somebody loose, right? You, I know, have now instituted a default private-only kind of communication system, right? That's 16. And I think that's very admirable. Again, I think it's shocking and amazing and admirable that you are sitting here as the CEO of this company talking about this. But I also think between that and, Mitch Prinstein just the other day posting on X, my own opinion, ban smartphones in classrooms, period. Bring back dumb phones for youth that allow text, music, GPS, and old school phone calls. By the way, I gave that phone to my kid. She hates that phone. Hates that phone. We fight about that weekly. But, right, that also, I would think, you show that to a hardware CEO, they hate that idea, right? The building in of new features and the trying to get younger and younger users is the key to making money in this business, or has been until now. Is 16 both enough from a public health perspective, and can you make a business out of going any further than that?
Yeah. So the example you gave, we made a decision on our platform that public profiles, public messaging were not safe under 16, and we didn't just make it private by default, we made it private only because we landed at the position that publicly discoverable profiles, publicly discoverable messaging just weren't safe for under 16. So that's the decision we made. It's been nearly a year ago. And I think those kinds of things are important to be thinking about, like what is an appropriate age for different kinds of activity. Social media is not uniform. You talked about that. I agree that I think it's not uniform. I think it's also the case, though, that when you look at the impacts on mental health, like yes, it is primarily a youth mental health crisis, right? And the impacts there are the most severe, and so we should be looking at that. I also think, though, if you step back, a lot of the things that we need to address in social media are not just youth mental health; it's everyone's mental health, right? That everyone gets affected when it's almost. At some point, you have to stop calling it social media. It's just media. If you look at the data, it's your primary form of media consumption. That's not just for young people.
Right.
That is nearly across every age range, and even for even for folks that may still consume more of their media through television, the television is influenced by what's happening on social media. So I actually think some of what we need to do is, yes, look at what is safe and appropriate for different ages, and I think there we're trying to raise the standards there, and I think trying to follow evidence-based, engaging with experts to think about what is safe and appropriate at different ages. It's also the case that I think we need to address some of the core issues of engagement via enragement as a business model, and that is most severe and most impactful on young people, but it affects everyone. And so that's what we've done with that, is to say, oh, well, if the AI could be told to maximize your view time and could figure out your trigger points to maximize your view time at any age, why can't we tune the AI for a different purpose? Why can't we ask it to lead to more positive outcomes? And what if we measured that and we looked at outcomes? And there's no shortage of tactics that have been discussed. But back to the automobile analogy, well, if you put safety belts in the car, but people are still dying, you'd say, well, we need to do something else. We need some airbags too, or we need a different kind of safety belt. I think we've got to start measuring on outcomes. We've got to start looking at what are the emotional well-being outcomes of time spent on these platforms, most critically for youth, but even beyond youth. I think we need to start measuring on those outcomes, and as an industry, holding ourselves accountable. Roughly a year ago, we launched the Inspired Internet Pledge with the Digital Wellness Lab at Boston Children's Hospital. And one of those components was measure on outcomes, but share the findings, share what works. And some of this is about not only what we do with the AI, but this is something I know you've written about as well, and I think we strongly agree on this point. How do you bring more choice back in for the user, right? We all grew up in a world where if we didn't like what we were watching, or our parents didn't like what we were watching, you could change the channel. But if all your media comes from one place, and your only input is whether you looked or didn't look, or whether you swiped or didn't swipe, you're left with not much of a choice. And we actually found that this is one of the things that we published, is that not only did we tune AI for more positive outcomes, we started to tune on things that were getting more explicit choices from users. And interestingly, when you give users more choice, while the triggering content rises to the top when your only input is whether you looked, it's sort of the metaphor I've used is an experience we've all had. You're stuck in a traffic jam, you're waiting to get up to the front of the traffic jam, you shouldn't look at the car crash, but of course we all sneak a peek to see, okay, well, why did I just sit here for 45 minutes? So you look at the car crash. And in an algorithmically derived feed, it learns, oh, you looked at the car crash.
You love car crashes.
I'll show you another car crash.
Yeah.
Oh, you looked at that one too. I'll show you another car crash. And you look at that one too, until eventually your feed is all car crashes. But the thing that we proved out is if you build in checkpoints, if you ask somebody, do you want to see another car crash? The vast majority of people say, oh no, that was terrible. I don't want to see another one. So the more we started to tune on things like what you said you wanted to see again, right? Where people took more explicit action. And you can still have an algorithm involved, but you can have more explicit action. So back to your question of how do we think about these things? I think, yes, we need to be doing more for youth mental health. I think we need to be doing more for mental health broadly, measuring on outcomes, and then sharing findings like, okay, you can still have AI play a positive role, but I think you've got to think about AI as, it's another metaphor I use is it's sort of like, asking a genie for wishes, right? Sometimes the genie grants wishes in ways you didn't expect. So measure the outcomes and see if you actually got what you expected. And if you didn't, go revisit and do something different, like, well, retune for positivity, bring in more explicit choice by the user, things like that. So I think all those things have to be part of a basket of solutions for participants in this space.
If I can pick it up on
Please.
that too, Bill, because I absolutely think regulation is important. I mean, it's like this Wild West, right? It's the only medium, that is unregulated. When you look out there, it's incredible. But it's also about leading by example, which Bill has done so well. And a lot of the things that we're doing today, Sesame also has an organization called the Joan Gantz Cooney Lab, which is named for the founder of Sesame, and it's an independent innovation and research lab. And so we're working with UNICEF, with Lego Group on something called RITEC, which is the responsibility for innovation in technology for children. Because there are a lot of designers out there and game developers and media creators who would welcome guidelines to help us understand what is best practice? What would we need to do? And we're really investing in that research and that even creating fellows from some incredible places like Roblox and PBS Kids and iCivic and Bill Pinterest has helped fund this too, where we have fellows and we're helping them design research-based, engaging content and gaming for children with their emotional well-being at the center. Because I think we have to show, Sesame Street is a great example. This is something that was 55 years ago. We've always been a nonprofit 501c3, but we created a program that is so impactful. There are more studies on the efficacy and outcomes of Sesame than any other children's program, but we also proved that it could be commercially successful. So we have the opportunity to create all these other programs that people want to do because Sesame showed you there's a way to do that. So I think if we can be investing in real evidence-based, real research and empowering those who do want to do well, to create content and gaming for young children that is the example. We should regulate, but we should also inspire, and we should also invest in that creativity with children in mind. And all these platforms, people don't look at it from the lens of children. And I think we have a responsibility to do so.
So Dr. Fasson, right, you're surrounded now by folks talking about public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
Obviously heart's in the right place, but have this idea that you can sort of do well and do good. How are you feeling?
Yeah, it sounds great, and God bless you. And no, I give
still have seatbelts and
I give Kenneth a lot of credit for the SOS standards, because in the absence of strong standards coming out of Washington, coming out of states, we do need to start figuring out what that floor is. You said
Can I
something
also
very important.
Just to set the stage here, like for anybody who doesn't know, right? The United States is an absolute outlier in the regulatory regime,
Correct.
right? China, if you're in China, if you live in China, I have friends, colleagues, journalists who live there, and their children literally only listen to Spotify playlists, the equivalent of Spotify in China, that are mandated by the government. There's a child-safe playlist that the government just gives you, and they just use that, right? In Europe, they have a whole regulatory regime laid out for this. In the United States, there's nothing. And so that's important to just, for anybody who doesn't know that.
Yeah, and look, I think you said something very important. This gets down to the business fundamentals of what these platforms are designed for, and they are designed to keep your eyeballs on the platform for as long as possible. On average, the industry makes about $1 billion a year on targeted ads to children, to minors. Targeted ads to minors. That's $1 billion that's got to go somewhere, right? And so I love the idea of more choice, more flexibility, more creativity, but it has to be a robust floor, not just a weak floor.
So let's talk about
and
that.
The Kids Online Safety Act is a start. It's
Okay.
not the end. It's not a panacea.
Right.
It's a start. And we've got finally a House sponsor. We've had Senate sponsors. That needs to get passed and signed into law so we can begin the process of bringing some shape and regulation to this entirely unregulated industry. The only other industry I can think of as deregulated as this is guns.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous. We know what gun violence does in this country. So we have to, it's all of the above, right? We have to be creative. We have to bring people to the center of this. No one said get rid of cars, right? No one said get rid of the highway system. They said make it safer. So all we're asking is to make it safer, and government has a really important role to play, not the only role.
I do wonder if I would have been one of those people back then saying, no cars, we shouldn't be doing cars. I feel like I'm in that position.
But government needs, regulations can only come from regulatory process, the government in this case. So, and that is a process that takes time because they only know what they know, and there's all these forces at work. And you have all these tech platforms that are at odds with each other, and they are prioritizing all this content, and it's all agnostic. So these algorithms don't even know what they're putting out there. They're just responding to what they're just giving you more of what you're engaging with. So what you're enraging with, and they'll allow you to engage with. So absent of, and then also the platforms can't concede because then they're going to lose market share. So I'm fine playing by the rules, but not if I'm the only one playing.
Right.
But only if those rules are mine, it doesn't work, and not if I have to come up with them by myself.
Yeah.
So, but if there are standards that apply that are that are cross-functional, that across the board, everybody will get on board. And ultimately, I mean, AI is going to be a bigger, but we need to get this first, and then ultimately they're going to have to figure out that. But absent of standards, we're in
But
the
it
Wild
will
West, to your
affect the
point.
bottom line, and that's where this.
It's
and
going to
that's
affect
why
the
I'm
bottom line.
very.
It's so
eager to
impressive
see
what
Pinterest is doing.
Sherry's done with
Emotional well-being overall.
emotional
mental health.
with our collective well-being, and what Bill has done. This is not easy to do in the corporate marketplace because we're also dealing in a competitive universe.
Yep.
So
And a fiduciary responsibility, right? There's you can be in legal trouble for leaving money on the table, right?
Yeah. I think
running a
there's-
company like yours.
right.
I think there's a, by the way, I strongly agree that I think over time you start to have a desire for common standards, right? And so would strongly support, minimum safety standards, common standards. The patchwork that's developing probably is going to end up not being good for anybody, and so you'd want to have more common standards. I do think, though, this point of like it impacts the bottom line, I actually think my view of it is I think it's more about short-term versus long-term. And are you willing to solve for the long-term? So the example I gave earlier of us implementing, messaging being private only under 16, profiles private only under 16. The next quarter after we announced that, we had uncertainty as to what that would do to our user growth. And in that quarter, our stock dropped almost 20%, I think. And so in the short term, it was painful.
Because user growth is bedrock.
Because
strategy.
we had to talk about, hey, this could be a headwind.
Right.
Now, we made the decision to do it because we felt it was the right thing. And fortunately, I had good support from my board
good.
and from our investors, where I said, like, I think this is the right thing to do long term. I think that we can actually differentiate on this. I think it can be good business, but you've got to make a long-term bet versus a short-term bet. And it wasn't that long-term because a year later, we've doubled.
Yeah, that's
And Gen Z is now our largest, fastest growing demographic. And if you ask them, they will say one of the primary reasons they come to Pinterest is they see it as an oasis away from the toxicity they experience elsewhere in social media. And so I do think you can build a good business. And that's not me saying there shouldn't be thoughtful regulation. But I think, as you said, it's a floor. And like, I want to see a world where, like, yes, we should have a minimum set of standards, but I'd really love to see a world where we're competing to exceed those standards and competing on, how much more we can do to protect and keep people safe. And one thing I'd add on, the notion that the platforms are agnostic. I think what I would say as somebody who has contributed these algorithms, and designed these products, it's not editorial choice in the same way as an editorial choice in a newspaper. It's not the same as that. But you do make choices, like that choice to say, we don't think publicly discoverable profiles are safe under 16. I think there's also choices that are made where when you look at the design of a lot of these platforms, particular for teens, and this is particularly pertinent to youth mental health, a lot of the designs are preying upon things like social hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
As you become a teenager, social hierarchy starts to become really important. Well, if you start to build more and more features where your self-worth is driven by how many likes did my post get, how many people are following, where do I fall in the hierarchy of a friend group? These are all features being designed and shipped that obviously
They're not coincidental.
prey upon this issue of social hierarchy, which is one of the biggest drivers of anxiety for teens. So I do think there are things like this that are getting to your point of like designing for this. I do think that product design is important. It's not an editorial choice in that, no, you're not seeing every piece of content, but you choose what you tune the algorithm for. Do you tune the algorithm to maximize view time, or do you tune the algorithm for positive outcomes? These are choices.
Could you imagine a world in which we actually regulate on the basis of those KPIs? That we say a company that builds their bottom line on engagement has to play by a whole other set of legal rules and legal responsibilities than someone who says, I'm going to leave some money on the table and go after something else. Would you be up for that kind of regulation?
We have come out, and we're not waiting for the regulation. We came out and said we are going to measure ourselves on it, report on it, share our findings, and commit to continually getting better. So, we're not waiting. We're not waiting for the regulation. We're stepping up to try to do that. But I think this is a place where it does need more partnership. This is why we did the Inspired Internet Pledge, asking others to participate as well. Because I do think there is a point around how do you get industries aligning around these things. There's a need for an organizing function around that, but I do think there's a need for common standards, common measurement,
Yeah.
and accountability around those things.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And it's about leadership.
Yeah, right.
You're exuding leadership. You're leading in a way that, I mean, look, we know from the Attorney General's suit that there's so much evidence, right, that, and I don't think I'm saying anything that isn't public, that if companies are making these billions, tens of hundreds of billions of dollars, and in one case it was recommended that Facebook put just tens of millions, not even, into safety measures. And everyone in the company was recommending it, and it was shot down by the head of Meta. That's not leadership. That's not leadership. And I'm curious, just curious, I mean, how can we create a safer world if we have people only focused on their personal pocketbooks?
Well, I mean, I think again, is this a place where thoughtful regulation can help? I would think, I would think so. And I think these points of like, how do you establish minimum standards? I agree, but I think also, if you can prove a business model by doing things that are good for people, like switch the metaphor, big tobacco certainly needed thoughtful regulation, right? You also needed a health revolution to counter it. And so to me, it's not either or, it's both. You need both things.
I think about
you need a health revolution in this.
I think about it like historical analogies, like, before Prohibition, it was perfectly legal for the brewer, distributor, and retailer of an alcoholic beverage to be all the same company. So Anheuser-Busch could own the bars and the distribution of it. The number one killer of men at that time was cirrhosis of the liver. That was the number one cause of death. Now we don't allow that anymore. Now you have to divide it up. The bar has to be owned separately from the trucking company and separate from the brewer. I would argue we still have a huge amount of trouble. I was an alcoholic, and I am an alcoholic, and so there's still some trouble there. But that's the thing where we created some kind of floor, some kind of floor. We've somehow determined that there's an acceptable number of alcohol deaths each year, and that's somehow okay. But we've come to some kind of floor around it, and there's nothing around it now. In the final moments we have here, does anyone on the stage believe that there is? So one trope I hear a lot from, or I used to hear a lot from tech CEOs, was, well, we just need to improve media literacy. People just need to be more literate, and then they will somehow be resistant to the predations of my company, right? And it always felt like a dodge to me. It felt like a talking point and a shifting of responsibility off of people. But it feels to me like the responsible gambling model, which I think is not true. Responsible drinking, I can't do any responsible drinking, that's why I don't drink anymore. And I wonder if anyone on the stage wants to make a case for sort of what parents can do. We have a question from the audience about, what can parents specifically do to counteract this? Part of me, I just think it shouldn't be up to parents.
It shouldn't.
But
And it's a powerful addictive substance, right? I talked about the neurotransmitters. But the other thing, we did a convening about a year ago at Rockefeller with parents on a day off from school, with Mitch and all these folks from around the country, with folks from California, from your office, but also with young people who are off school. And what they told us was, parents, start modeling better behavior. You're complicit in this.
That's a good point.
Get your phones out of our dinner tables, get your phones out of my room, pay attention to me, and don't just punish your way out of this. Talk to me about it, help me be safe online, because they know they want help, but they want better role models. So what parents can do, and I struggle with this as well, I'm on my phone all the time for work, and we can be better ourselves. We have that frontal lobe regulation. We can put this thing down, even though it's powerfully addictive. But imagine their vulnerable brains, they can't. This ethical use or responsible media literacy for an 8-year-old, for a 14-year-old, it's mind-blowing that we would be thinking this way. So I think it starts with us. It starts with us. Again, this is not about taking anything away from anybody. This is about reshaping our relationships with these devices that are not going anywhere, with these platforms that are not going anywhere. They're part of our lives, as you said. So reshape our relationships.
Well, I think we all have a responsibility. So I think absolutely government regulation, but parents too. But they need tools and they need resources to understand what to do. Yes, don't model the same behavior, and here are some choices you can make. that will be better for the entire family. And that's a lot of the research we're doing with Google, because I think the more we can provide resources and tools for parents to start young, but also to understand what parameters would be helpful and what they should be avoiding. I think parents just don't know. I mean, it's really so hard for them too. So I think there is a role for all of us. And I do agree. It's not just, oh, media literacy will take care of it.
Yeah.
But I want to compliment Ken too, because even though we're talking about digital and about technology and the impact, which whether or not there's real, evidence that it's, causation versus correlation, we all know it's an issue. But to also be addressing the mental health crisis, regardless of the causes, that the more we do to make parents aware that starts young, giving children the tools to understand when the signs, what are the signs if it's a really serious, and which we've done with Ken, help destigmatize.
Yeah.
Elmo tweets, how are you doing? I mean, we do a lot to destigmatize mental health. It's okay to talk about, it's okay to ask for help. And I think that underlying issue is something we have to address as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think this question, Ken, right? I mean, stigma has been a big thing. I feel like as a culture, especially in the United States, we are the world of Han Solo. Don't tell me the odds. I'm going through the asteroid field. We don't want to make boring, rational decisions, and we also don't want to cop to how irrational we are. I wondered, I know part of the Mental Health Coalition's work is in the destigmatizing is also just wanting to be able to, speak more openly about, we don't talk about addiction in this country. We don't talk about.
And 2/3 of the people that are living with mental health issues do so in the proverbial shadows. So that's the biggest part of the biggest problem. So they don't acknowledge it often to themselves, let alone to the universe, and they don't have the tools to do it. So our biggest objective is to help come up with a new narrative and tools that help them get there. But I love what was just said too about the kids, and it was Mark Twain's. And sometimes kids they sometimes hear what you say, but they always see what you do. So we need to be better role models, and and also we as our company, the fashion business, we've worked with Sesame Street on a project which has been great, and we also work with Pinterest whenever we can. So this is a great convening. So thank you for that. For this.
Yeah, go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, and I would just say, I just made a documentary on the caregiving crisis and the realities of being a 21st century dual income household and the challenges to American families. I'm always cautious to put things back on teachers, put things back on kids. So I think this is this new, I love the idea of a health revolution, or just the concept that we all are living in this time where we have to acknowledge all that parents are juggling. The frenzied, fast-paced modern living, the tech, the fact that you kind of need a phone to even go to a restaurant these days and order your food.
The menu.
Yes, but that there is this opportunity in front of us again to center health in a new way, and I really appreciate that framing for the private sector to play its role and take responsibility in partnership with the public sector. And then again, obviously, we are a country that loves to put responsibility back on the individual. Yeah. It would just be given all that families juggle, and I'm speaking from a place of also really understanding that even though more and more men are stepping into care, women are holding so much. We hold the mental load. We have careers, we're running companies while we're raising young children. And so there is this sort of naivete and trust. You buy a product, you think it's safe, and you realize it's not. Just like you buy food, think it's safe, and it's perhaps not. Or you buy a skincare product and think it's safe, and it's perhaps not. So I think there's this, this educational piece, yes, and individuals need to take responsibility. And we need to really kind of partner more to get through this so that we're leaving the world in a better place.
Yeah.
Because public sector, we can't do it on our own. California state can't do it on our own. We're doing everything. We've invested in all the work around addressing the stigma of mental health and suicide prevention and this and that. We've put so much money into this. but again, technology, social media, it does not, there are no fences or borders or, you know.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of work, but I love this. I love how we could continue to partner together
Yeah.
Absolutely.
and
I'll
find new
finish-
ways to partner.
Thank you.
That's right.
What you do.
I'll finish here with an anecdote that I just thought of based on this conversation where I was talking to a high school teacher in Berkeley, California, who he was trying to just figure out, what do I do with these kids coming in with their phones? They goof off on the phones during the class. What do I do? And he invented this system that he calls the phone bowl. It's at the front of the class, and basically what they had found is that you know, even kids for whom this is very out of line, if you took the phone away from them forcibly, they would go all the way to get it back. So much so that they would rather be sent to detention, the equivalent of whatever they call detention now at Berkeley High, to get it back. And you know, they'd be transformed basically in their effort to keep going with the phone. And so instead he created this system where just an improvisational thing. If you put the phone into the bowl, you get a little bit of credit toward a better grade. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of a grade, but it's a little bit of an incentive. Just we've been talking about so much about incentives here. And if you don't, and he catches you on the phone, you lose the phone anyway, right? So there's nothing but stick if you skip the bowl. You don't have to put it in the bowl, but if you're caught with it, that's it. And not only do the majority of the kids put the phone into the bowl, they've been asking him, can you go please tell the other teachers about the phone bowl? We've been trying to bring up the phone bowl to other teachers, and we don't, you know, and they don't know about that. Can you tell them about the phone bowl? And I just feel like we're just at such a primitive moment, the most primitive money-making moment and the most primitive regulatory moment around this stuff. I feel like, I don't know, if the sophistication of this panel is anything to suggest, we can do this, right? We can come up, we're smart people, we're a good, you know, we're a good smart country, we can solve this problem, so.
We need a bowl.
We need bowls, we need more bowls. Please thank our
I
panel.
love that idea.
Yeah.
So